Throughout the history of humanity, certain mysteries seem to echo through the ages, challenging our understanding and planting seeds of deep curiosity. Among these enigmas is the enigmatic figure of Melchizedek, a king and priest mentioned briefly but impactfully in the Holy Scriptures. Who was he? Why was his appearance so brief and yet so significant? The mention of him is not limited to the Old Testament. It extends to Christian texts, revealing something much deeper and mysterious, a spiritual lineage that transcends time. The biblical text in Genesis introduces us to Melchizedek as a priest of the Most High God, who emerges from nowhere to bless Abraham, offering bread and wine. This seemingly simple encounter carries a complex symbolism and appears to announce something far greater than it seems. Centuries later, in the book of Hebrews, Jesus is directly compared to Melchizedek, not just as a similar figure, but as the fulfillment of an eternal priestly order. Here arises the central question that challenges scholars, theologians, and spiritual seekers. Was Jesus the direct heir to a very ancient spiritual lineage? Would this lineage be a bridge between the divine and the human, transcending traditional priestly lineages? What makes this connection even more astonishing is the fact that Melchizedek is described as someone without genealogy, without beginning of days, and without end of life. This description suggests not just an absence of historical record, but something much deeper, a timeless being without beginning or end. This creates an intriguing parallel with the very nature of Jesus, who is called Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. But what does all of this really mean? How can we understand the impact of this lineage on the narrative of redemption and on the spiritual journey of humanity? Many wonder if Melchizedek was a historical human being, a divine manifestation, or even an archetype that carries a universal teaching about leadership, faith, and spiritual elevation. For the more curious, this story is not just a distant or mythological account. It touches on profound existential questions. What is the true role of a priest in the spiritual journey? What is the path to achieving a state of union with the divine? Moreover, the figure of Melchizedek seems to point to a larger plan, a divine project that spans ages and found its climax in Jesus of Nazareth. This plot full of symbolism arouses a fascination that goes beyond traditional religious beliefs. Since the emergence of the first civilizations, the figures of kings and priests were seen as intermediaries between heaven and earth, leading not only by power, but by a spiritual connection with something superior. The presence of Melchizedek suggests that he had a special authority, conferred directly by the divine, something that surpasses earthly rituals and points to a lineage of heavenly purpose. It's this connection that makes the story even more engaging. Jesus is not only presented as the promised Messiah, but as someone who participates in this higher order, transcending human rules and limitations. He is described as an eternal priest, capable of offering a definitive sacrifice, not of animals, but of himself, ushering in a new era of reconciliation and renewal. This leads us to reflect. Could it be that Melchizedek represented the announcement of a higher priesthood, where service and surrender surpass the old rituals? And if so, what does this teach us about our own spiritual life? Are we also called to participate in this invisible lineage through our attitudes, choices, and devotion? The introduction of this theme shows us that we are not just facing a historical or theological question, but rather an invitation to explore an eternal mystery. This is a path that invites us to look beyond appearances and understand that, behind each sacred figure, there is a divine purpose, an invitation to elevation. In this journey, we will proceed together, exploring each piece of this spiritual puzzle. The connection between Jesus and Melchizedek is not just a detail in the ancient texts. It's a key to understanding a divine plan that encompasses not only individuals, but the very essence of humanity. I invite you to proceed in this investigation filled with discoveries and symbolism. The past, after all, may hold surprising answers to questions that continue to echo in the present. Melchizedek is one of the most mysterious figures in the Holy Scriptures, mentioned briefly, but with an impressive symbolic depth. His name first appears in the book of Genesis 14:18-20, during an unexpected episode that changed the course of Abraham's journey. In this account, Abraham had just returned victorious from a battle against enemy kings to rescue his nephew Lot. On his way back, he is surprised by the presence of a king priest named Melchizedek, who introduces himself as the King of Salem and priest of the Most High God. The meeting, seemingly brief, is filled with meaning. Melchizedek brings bread and wine, elements that would later gain profound symbolism in the Christian tradition, and blesses Abraham with words that echo to this day. Blessed be Abraham by the Most High God, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God who has delivered your enemies into your hands. In response, Abraham offers Melchizedek a tithe of everything he had won, a gesture that reveals not only gratitude, but recognition of his spiritual authority. However, who was this king priest? Where did he come from and where did he go after this encounter? The biblical text remains silent on these issues, further enhancing the mystery. The name Melchizedek carries with it significant symbolism. In Hebrew, Melchizedek means king of righteousness. He is also identified as the king of Salem, a word that refers to shalom, that is, peace. Thus, Melchizedek is not just a human leader. He represents an archetype of righteousness and peace, attributes that point to a divine plan. Being both a king and a priest is a rare and powerful thing, as it unifies two roles that, in later biblical traditions, would be separated. The kings came from the lineage of Judah and the priests from the tribe of Levi. This unification in Melchizedek suggests that he belongs to a different order, preceding the traditional lineages of Israel. There is no record of his descent or lineage, nor mention of his parents, something extremely unusual in biblical narratives, which usually take care to detail genealogies. This absence of origin reinforces his image as a timeless being, someone who had no beginning of days nor end of existence, as described later in the letter to the Hebrews. Another intriguing aspect is the place where Melchizedek reigned, Salem. Many scholars believe that Salem would be a reference to the future Jerusalem, a city that, over the centuries, would become the spiritual heart of various religious traditions. This makes Melchizedek seen by some as a prophetic precursor to the promised messianic peace. However, beyond the historical questions, there is an even deeper spiritual element. Melchizedek is not only described as a righteous man and God-fearing, but as a representative of a pure and elevated priesthood, uncorrupted by political disputes or external rituals. His priesthood points directly to a spiritual service that transcends institutionalized religion and connects to the divine purpose of unification and reconciliation. Various apocryphal and esoteric traditions have also tried to shed light on his identity. Some ancient texts identify him as an angelic manifestation, while others suggest that he was Sem himself, son of Noah, or even a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. These interpretations may seem speculative, but they show how the figure of Melchizedek transcends conventional definitions and has become a powerful symbol of spiritual leadership and divine purity. The meeting between Melchizedek and Abraham was not just a historical event, but a milestone in the spiritual narrative that establishes a sacred covenant. Melchizedek, with his blessing, confirms Abraham's mission as the father of a great nation and participant in a larger divine plan. The offering of bread and wine, simple and universal elements, symbolizes a communion that transcends formal rituals, pointing to a direct connection with the sacred. But why would this brief appearance of Melchizedek have such a lasting impact? The reason may lie in the idea that he embodies a model of divine service that predates human rules and boundaries. Unlike the Levitical priests, whose legitimacy depended on their lineage, Melchizedek was legitimized directly by the Most High God. This makes him a precursor to something greater, an echo of what would be fully manifested in Jesus Christ, who is also described as a priest in the order of Melchizedek. In the next stage of our journey, we will see how the Jewish and Christian tradition deepened this concept, and why the figure of this priest-king continues to inspire theories, reflections, and symbolism that transcend. Since the first mentions of Melchizedek in the Hebrew Scriptures, his figure has inspired debates and interpretations in various spiritual traditions. In Judaism, he is remembered as an extraordinary priest, independent of conventional lineages. In Christianity, he is recognized as an archetype of the eternal priesthood of Jesus Christ. This duality makes him a unique figure, capable of moving between different eras and beliefs, unifying seemingly opposing concepts. In ancient Judaism, Melchizedek is seen as a special character, but shrouded in mystery. The Torah describes kings and priests as fundamental figures for the stability of Israel, but always belonging to specific lineages. Kings descended from the tribe of Judah, while priests came from the tribe of Levi, specifically from the lineage of Aaron, Moses' brother. However, Melchizedek did not belong to any of these genealogies. This raises an intriguing question. How could he be a priest without being a Levite, centuries before the Levites existed as a priestly caste? The answer to this question is found in texts such as Psalm 110, where David writes, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, in the order of Melchizedek." This verse reinforces the idea that there exists a different priestly lineage, an eternal and incorruptible order above human norms. This mention in the psalm created a direct bridge to Christian writings, especially the Epistle to the Hebrews, where Jesus is proclaimed as the fulfillment of this prophetic promise. The Epistle to the Hebrews, one of the most theological texts of the New Testament, dedicates an entire chapter to the comparison between Jesus and Melchizedek. The author emphasizes that Jesus does not belong to the Levitical priesthood, but is a priest according to the order of Melchizedek, something superior and eternal. In Hebrews 7:3, the text highlights, "Without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, he remains a priest forever." Here, Melchizedek is not just a historical being, but a symbolic figure, a model that transcends time and points to the work of Jesus. The idea of an eternal priesthood carries an important message. It is not limited to ritualistic sacrifices or temporary ceremonies. The priesthood of Melchizedek, and by extension that of Jesus, is a priesthood based on definitive redemption, on the union of the divine with the human, symbolizing reconciliation and spiritual renewal. In addition to the canonical biblical texts, other apocryphal documents and Jewish writings, such as the Book of Jubilees and the Dead Sea Scrolls, also mention Melchizedek, sometimes in an even more supernatural way. In the 11q Melchizedek fragment, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, he is described as a celestial being, a divine liberator who will defeat the forces of evil during the final Jubilee year, bringing redemption to God's people. This text reinforces the perception of Melchizedek as a figure that surpasses human nature and approaches a messianic role. Another fascinating point is that, in the context of Jewish tradition, Melchizedek is seen by some scholars as a prefigure of the Messiah. He represents an era of justice and peace that the world is still waiting for. Therefore, when Jesus is described as an eternal priest, the implication is clear. He not only fulfills the role of intermediary between God and men, but also inaugurates a new era of spiritual restoration. However, this view also sparked debates. Some rabbis interpreted Melchizedek in a more symbolic way, considering him as an example of obedience and justice that Abraham followed, while others advocated for a literal reading, believing that he was a direct manifestation of God or an incarnated angel. In early Christianity, this idea gained even more strength, as many theologians believed that Melchizedek was a typology of Christ, a symbolic figure that foreshadowed the coming of the Messiah. The impact of this association deeply reflected in the Christian liturgy. The bread and wine offered by Melchizedek to Abraham were reinterpreted as a foreshadowing of Jesus' Eucharistic sacrifice at the Last Supper, when he also shared bread and wine with his disciples, declaring, "This is my body, this is my blood." Thus, Melchizedek is seen as a precursor of a new covenant, not based on external rituals, but on a deep and universal spiritual surrender. The symbolism of this eternal lineage brings to light a powerful concept. Justice and peace, represented by Melchizedek, are not just individual virtues but universal principles that guide the divine plan. Jesus, being proclaimed as a priest according to this order, assumes not only a religious function, but a comprehensive mission of redemption, promising a definitive restoration between the Creator and creation. In this way, the figure of Melchizedek traverses Judaism and Christianity as a testament to the continuity of the divine plan. He not only blesses Abraham, but inaugurates a spiritual lineage that doesn't depend on blood, but on purpose. This lineage points to a new era, where the walls of separation are torn down and humanity is called to participate in a universal priesthood of service, faith, and reconciliation. As we move forward, we will explore how this idea of an eternal priesthood transcended the Judeo-Christian context and manifested itself in other spiritual traditions around the world, showing that the mystery of Melchizedek carries a universal teaching that goes beyond religious bound. When we delve into the figure of Melchizedek, we cannot ignore the most intriguing detail of his description. He is presented as someone without father, without mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life. This definition transcends any historical reference and elevates him to an almost mythical figure, eternally present, with a role that surpasses common human understanding. This leads us to an essential question. What does it mean to be an eternal priest? The idea of an eternal priest directly contrasts with the traditional priests of the Levitical lineage. The Levite priests, descendants of Aaron, assumed their role based on bloodline and were limited by their mortality. They needed to be replaced as they aged or died, and their offices depended on a series of strict rules about rituals and sacrifices. Meanwhile, the priesthood, according to the order of Melchizedek, is not defined by human descent, but rather by a direct and perpetual connection with God, making it immutable and infinite. The author of the Epistle to the Hebrews uses this characteristic to explain why Jesus is superior to the ancient priests. In Hebrews 7:16-17 it is written, "He was appointed not according to the law of a carnal commandment, but according to the power of an indestructible life. For it is witnessed of him, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." This expression, indestructible life, is central to understanding what it means to be an eternal priest. Melchizedek, like Jesus, does not belong to the realm of human limitations. His priesthood is not marked by temporary or repetitive sacrifices, but by a single and complete act of redemption. In the case of Jesus, this act was the sacrifice of himself, which symbolizes victory over death and the inauguration of a new spiritual covenant. But how to understand this idea of eternity in practice? Many theologians and scholars interpret Melchizedek as a being beyond time, someone whose priestly mission is not tied to a specific historical moment, but to a continuous divine plan. This plan does not depend on external rituals, but rather on a profound inner transformation and a full surrender to divine service. This explains why the author of Hebrews makes a point of highlighting that Jesus did not come to perpetuate the old rituals of sacrifice, but to establish a new covenant based on faith, compassion, and renewal. Furthermore, the eternity of Melchizedek's priesthood leads us to reflect on a central theme in spirituality: the idea of continuity and eternal purpose. Unlike earthly priesthoods, which are temporary and often marked by human interests, the eternal priesthood points to a mission that transcends the boundaries of space and time. Jesus, when compared to Melchizedek, is presented as the one who carries this timeless purpose, not only to reconcile humans with God, but to completely transform the relationship between the divine and the mortal. The concept of without beginning or end also resonates with an idea present in various spiritual traditions, that certain spiritual beings transcend the cycles of birth and death. In Hinduism, for example, there is mention of the immortal rishis, wise men who remain in elevated states of consciousness for ages. In Buddhism, there are discussions about bodhisattvas, who continue to be active in helping humanity, even after achieving enlightenment. This parallel reinforces that the image of an eternal priest is not exclusive to Christianity or Judaism, but carries a universal symbolism of continuous and divine service. But was Melchizedek a common human being? Some scholars suggest that he might be a direct manifestation of God, or even a pre-incarnation of Christ himself, a theophanic figure who appeared to prepare the way. Others, however, argue that he was an extraordinary human being, whose life was described symbolically to convey eternal spiritual truths. Either way, Melchizedek's role transcends the context in which he appears, pointing to a priesthood that is not limited to formal rites, but is based on justice, peace, and unconditional surrender to the divine. This eternal priesthood teaches us that true spiritual leadership does not depend on titles, lineages, or ceremonies, but rather on a heightened state of consciousness. Melchizedek was called the King of Righteousness and King of Peace, not for his political position, but for representing a divine standard of conduct. Similarly, Jesus not only inherited this mission, but embodied it in its entirety, offering a path to universal reconciliation. The idea of a lineage without beginning or end also invites us to reflect on our own spiritual journey. We are often limited by beliefs that the sacred is confined to external rituals or specific figures. However, the priesthood of Melchizedek shows us that there is a greater invitation to become participants in an eternal purpose, living with justice, compassion, and service, regardless of external circumstances. As we delve deeper into this idea, we realize that the true priesthood is not about following rules, but about the desire to be instruments of something greater. The lineage of Melchizedek and its perpetuation in Jesus point to a way of life that seeks to reconnect humans with their divine essence, transcending the barriers imposed by mortality and time. Finally, this understanding broadens our perception of what it means to be in tune with a spiritual calling. Melchizedek reminds us that, just like him and Jesus, we are called to awaken our connection with the eternal, transcending limitations and living with purpose. The journey continues, and in the next step we will see how Jesus fully assumed this role, fulfilling the prophecies and revealing the true meaning of the eternal priesthood. The figure of Jesus as the high priest according to the order of Melchizedek is one of the most enigmatic and powerful points in Christian scriptures. The Epistle to the Hebrews highlights this connection in detail, positioning Jesus not only as the expected Messiah, but as the representative of a superior, eternal, and incorruptible priesthood. This comparison is not random. It seeks to demonstrate that Jesus is not a common priest, subject to human weaknesses and limitations, but rather someone who carries a divine authority that dates back to the earliest times, to the very essence of God. In the biblical context, the Levite priests had a fundamental role, conducting sacrifices for the atonement of the people's sins. These sacrifices were repeated annually on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and consisted of offering animal blood to purify the altar and the people. However, even with all this complex liturgy, the priests had to repeat the rituals continuously, as they themselves were fallible and mortal. Moreover, their office depended solely on belonging to the lineage of Levi. Jesus, however, did not come from this lineage. He was a descendant of the tribe of Judah, the royal tribe of David, and had no formal connection with the Levitical priesthood. This is where the order of Melchizedek comes into play. According to Hebrews 7:22-27, Jesus not only fulfills this priestly function in a superior way, but also accomplishes something completely new and definitive. Such a high priest truly meets our need, one who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins, and then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. This passage emphasizes that Jesus' sacrifice was not a symbolic ritual, but a real and unique surrender, whose efficacy is eternal. Unlike the Levitical priests, he did not need to atone for his own sins, as he was without blemish. And unlike repetitive sacrifices, his offering was sufficient for all eternity. This makes Jesus not only the mediator of a new covenant, but the very altar and offering. But why is the order of Melchizedek so significant in this narrative? Because it doesn't rely on genealogies or human rules, but rather on a divine choice that transcends time. Melchizedek was introduced as someone without genealogy, just as Jesus is described as the Word that was with God from the beginning. The parallel between both reinforces the idea that the divine plan didn't start with Moses or Abraham, but predates the creation of the universe itself. Furthermore, the symbolism of bread and wine in Melchizedek's appearance anticipates the Last Supper, where Jesus shared these same elements with his disciples, saying, "This is my body, this is my blood." This act was not just a ritual, but a representation of his priestly mission, to offer himself as spiritual nourishment and a symbol of an eternal covenant. In this way, Jesus reaffirms his role as priest-king, but of a kingdom that is not earthly, but spiritual. Another crucial point is that the order of Melchizedek carries a meaning of permanence and continuity. While Levitical priests died and needed to be replaced, Jesus remains forever, resurrected and glorified. In Hebrews 7:24 we read, "But because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood." This immutability is the key to understanding the true power of Christ's priesthood. He is not just a temporary mediator, but an eternal representative of reconciliation between God and humanity. And unlike priests who interceded from a distance, Jesus experienced the human condition in its entirety. He knew pain, loneliness, and temptation, but remained faithful to the end. This makes him not just a priest, but a living example of how we can rise spiritually even amidst adversity. Another significant element in the comparison between Jesus and Melchizedek is the concept of justice and peace. As the King of Justice and King of Peace, Melchizedek did not rule by force, but by integrity and harmony. Similarly, Jesus brought a message of compassionate justice and enduring peace, offering a path of love and service to others. Instead of dominating, he humbled himself. Instead of condemning, he saved. The impact of this idea is profound. Jesus not only fulfills a prophecy, but inaugurates a new spiritual era, where justice and peace are not just abstract concepts, but living forces that transform the world. He demonstrates that true priesthood is not confined to the temple or rituals, but manifests in the ability to sacrifice oneself for the greater good. This makes Jesus' priesthood accessible to all who wish to live according to his example of compassion, faith, and love. The conclusion is clear. By being declared high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, Jesus not only assumed a title, but embodied an eternal mission of reconciliation and redemption. His priesthood is not just a model for religious leaders, but an invitation to all those who wish to live a life of justice and service. Just as Melchizedek blessed Abraham with bread and wine, Jesus offers us the supreme blessing, the promise of a new covenant, where the sacred and the human meet in perfect harmony. In the next chapter, we will explore how this idea of eternal priesthood finds parallels in other cultures and spiritual traditions, revealing that the pursuit of justice, peace, and elevation is not exclusive to one religion, but a universal call to the human soul. The figure of Melchizedek, with his aura of eternal king-priest, awakens a deep sense of universal recognition. It is not only in Judeo-Christian scriptures that we find spiritual leaders who unify justice, peace, and divine service. Various ancient traditions present similar archetypes, wise and leaders who transcend time and serve as mediators between the divine and the human, pointing to the universal quest for enlightenment, redemption, and spiritual balance. One of the most notable connections emerges in the Hindu tradition, with the figure of Krishna, described as a divine being who rules with justice and acts as a spiritual guide, offering profound teachings about duty and spiritual surrender. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna explains the importance of living aligned with the Dharma, the divine order, something that resonates with the role of Melchizedek as a king-priest. While Melchizedek offers bread and wine as symbols of communion and peace, Krishna offers knowledge as nourishment for the soul, leading his disciple Arjuna to a state of clarity and righteous action. In Zoroastrianism, we find Zoroaster, the prophet who preached the struggle between light and darkness, and who established a priesthood based on purity, truth, and justice. The concept of a pure intermediary between Ahura Mazda, the god of good and men, is another parallel with Melchizedek and his direct connection with the Most High God. Just as Melchizedek is described as without beginning or end, Zoroaster is associated with the eternal renewal of the cosmos, being a symbol of the eternal struggle and victory of light over darkness. In Egyptian traditions, we have the example of Osiris, the king who died and was reborn, representing the restoration of cosmic order and eternal justice. Osiris is often associated with the role of judge and eternal king of the underworld, someone who preserves the divine balance, just as Melchizedek is seen as the king of justice. The Egyptian ceremony of soul purification before Osiris refers to the idea of a priest-king who decides the fate of souls based on truth and peace, the same attributes associated with Melchizedek. Still in antiquity, in some Greek traditions, we find similar figures such as Asclepius, the god of healing and priest immortalized for his wisdom and compassion. Asclepius not only healed physical ailments, but also brought a sense of spiritual renewal, similar to the role of reconciliation that Melchizedek plays in his encounter with Abraham. This image of eternal priests who care for both the body and the soul reinforces the idea that justice and peace can only be achieved through a balance between the spiritual and the earthly. In Buddhism, the figure of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara is emblematic. Avalokiteshvara is the one who renounces complete nirvana to remain present in the world and help beings achieve enlightenment. His mission of eternal compassion and justice mirrors the same idea of an eternal and altruistic priesthood, where existence is not an end in itself, but a continuous service. The concept of remaining active in eternity, serving humanity, echoes the role of Melchizedek and the fulfillment of this lineage in Jesus Christ. Interestingly, some indigenous traditions also feature timeless spiritual leaders. In the beliefs of Amerindian peoples, such as the Mayans and Incas, there were priest-kings who represented communion with the sacred through purification rituals and celebrations of harmony with nature. The idea of a king of peace was materialized in leaders who maintained the natural order and ensured justice and prosperity through sacred alliances. All these figures have something in common. They do not exercise authority based on brute force, but rather on a profound sense of spiritual responsibility and selfless service. The king-priest is always the one who acts for the collective, in harmony with divine laws, regardless of personal rewards. Melchizedek is a precursor of this model, and Jesus, by being associated with him, elevates this role to its peak, showing that true spiritual leadership is total and loving surrender to humanity. The presence of similar figures in different cultures suggests something powerful. The archetype of the eternal priest-king is rooted in the collective unconscious of humanity. Since time immemorial, we have sought leaders who can transcend human limitations and guide us with wisdom and compassion. This search transcends geographical and cultural boundaries, pointing to a universal truth. At its core, the human being desires perfect justice and enduring peace. Another interesting point is how these figures represent the reconciliation of opposites. The king represents earthly authority, while the priest represents spiritual mediation. To unite these roles is to take on the responsibility of leading not only with laws and decrees, but with a soul focused on the well-being of all. Jesus, when compared to Melchizedek, is not just a spiritual leader, but the one who perfectly embodies the ideal of the King of Peace and the King of Justice. Therefore, when analyzing these traditions, it becomes clear that Melchizedek is not just an isolated character in the Judeo-Christian scriptures. He is a universal archetype, a symbol of service, balance, and connection with the sacred that appears in distinct forms in different cultures. Jesus, by being identified with this lineage, assumes a role that goes beyond the messianic expectations of his time and becomes the universal answer to the longing for redemption and justice. As we progress on our journey, we will see how this archetype of the eternal priest has inspired modern theories and continues to be a fascinating theme for scholars and spiritual seekers around the world. The legacy of Melchizedek and his full manifestation in Jesus invites us to explore the mysteries of eternity, service, and transcendence. Over the centuries, the figure of Melchizedek has become the subject of various interpretations and theories that go beyond traditional biblical texts. His enigmatic description, as someone without father, without mother, without genealogy, has fueled speculations that have spanned generations. After all, who or what was Melchizedek? An extraordinary human king, a divine manifestation, or an avatar, an incarnation of a higher principle in the earthly world? This chapter explores the main modern and ancient theories that seek to answer these questions. One of the hypotheses most advocated by traditional theologians is that Melchizedek was a real human king, whose life was described with symbolic characteristics to reinforce his spiritual role. According to this perspective, the absence of genealogy does not literally mean that he had no origin, but rather that his lineage was not relevant to his mission. Unlike the Levite priests, who needed to prove their descent, Melchizedek was legitimized by his righteousness and direct connection with God. However, this view does not fully explain why he was described as without beginning of days or end of life, something that suggests an existence beyond time. Another school of thought, present in apocryphal and esoteric texts, views Melchizedek as a divine manifestation or an angelic apparition. In Fragment 11, Q. Melchizedek, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, Melchizedek is described as an eschatological figure who, at the end of times, would bring redemption and defeat the powers of darkness. In this context, he is seen as a direct agent of God, almost an extension of the divine on the earthly plane. This view is fascinating, as it reinforces the idea that Melchizedek was not an ordinary human being, but an eternal servant whose mission transcends the ages. An intriguing modern theory is the idea that Melchizedek could be an avatar, a term more common in Eastern traditions, but which fits perfectly in this context. An avatar is a physical manifestation of a divine essence with the purpose of guiding humanity in crucial moments. In Hinduism, for example, Krishna and Rama are considered avatars of Vishnu, sent to restore cosmic order. In this sense, Melchizedek could be seen as a temporary manifestation of an eternal truth, divine justice and spiritual peace. His appearance to Abraham might have been a pivotal moment to reaffirm that the spiritual journey would not be guided solely by human rules, but by service and direct communion with God. Some Christian scholars suggest that Melchizedek was a theophany, that is, a visible manifestation of God or of Christ pre-incarnate. This theory finds support in the idea that Jesus, described as similar to Melchizedek, may have manifested himself before his earthly incarnation to announce the divine plan. This would explain why Melchizedek is described as someone without end of life. This line of thought is accepted by some theological currents, as it reinforces the narrative that Jesus has always been present in the history of salvation, even before his human birth. On the other hand, there are interpretations that flirt with mysticism. Some esoteric movements, such as the Rosicrucians and certain branches of the New Age, believe that Melchizedek would be an ascended master, a soul that has reached such a high level of enlightenment that it becomes immortal and continues to guide humanity from higher planes. This idea, although unorthodox, carries an interesting symbolism, that the eternal priesthood is not limited to the physical plane, but is a spiritual function that can be accessed by all those who transcend the ego and surrender to divine service. Other even more daring theories suggest that Melchizedek may have been an extraterrestrial or interdimensional being. This hypothesis is defended by some lines of ufological thought, which believe that advanced beings may have played fundamental roles in the spiritual and cultural development of ancient humanity. For these theorists, the description of Melchizedek as a being without beginning or end reinforces the idea of a being that transcends known natural laws and acts as a guide for spiritual evolution. However, all these theories, from the most traditional to the most alternative, agree on one point. Melchizedek represents something greater than a mere historical character. He is the symbol of a spiritual lineage that transcends time, space, and the barriers of mortality. This lineage points to a divine purpose that is not subject to human limitations, but manifests whenever the world needs justice, peace, and reconciliation. Jesus, when described as the fulfillment of this order, not only assumes the role of divine mediator, but also reaffirms that the spiritual journey is not based on dogmas and earthly lineages, but on a direct connection with the eternal. This idea transcends religions and invites each of us to reflect on our own connection with the sacred. After all, if Melchizedek is the example of an eternal priest, are we also called to access this eternity through our attitudes and choices? Finally, the mystery of Melchizedek reminds us that there is much more between heaven and earth than we can comprehend with our limited logic. Perhaps the most important thing is not to determine whether he was a historical king, an angel, or a divine manifestation, but rather to understand what he symbolizes: the eternal presence of justice and peace, ready to guide us towards a greater purpose. In the next chapter, we will explore the symbolism of Melchizedek's priesthood as an invitation to spiritual transformation and altruistic service, demonstrating how his story can inspire our personal and collective growth. When observing the figure of Melchizedek and his connection with Jesus, it's impossible not to reflect on the profound symbolism of the eternal priesthood. More than a title or an office, the priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek represents a spiritual journey of transformation and service. It is an invitation to humanity to transcend the limitations of the ego and take an active role in building a more just, harmonious world connected to the divine. Unlike the Levitical priesthood, which was based on specific rituals and heredity, the priesthood of Melchizedek is described as eternal, independent of human lineages, and without the need for repetitive sacrifices. This priesthood symbolizes the idea that the true connection with the sacred does not depend on external intermediaries or rigid dogmas, but rather on a sincere and constant commitment to the divine purpose. At the heart of this symbolism lies the idea of justice and peace, two fundamental pillars that appear both in the description of Melchizedek and in the mission of Jesus. To be a priest of justice does not only mean to act with equity, but to live in alignment with universal truth, placing the collective good above selfish interests. Peace, on the other hand, is not merely the absence of conflicts, but a state of profound harmony, the reconciliation of the human being with himself, with others, and with God. This model of priesthood suggests a radical paradigm shift, moving away from a mentality of religious transactions, where sacrifices were made to obtain forgiveness or blessings, and stepping into a path of selfless service, where the true sacrifice is the renunciation of ego and the surrender to the greater good. Jesus exemplifies this in his life and death, not only offering a symbolic ritual, but his very being as a living sacrifice, marking the beginning of a new covenant based on love, compassion, and transformation. The bread and wine offered by Melchizedek to Abraham symbolize this sacred communion. These elements, which appear again at the Last Supper, represent not only physical sustenance but also spiritual nourishment. They remind us that the true nourishment of the soul comes from sharing, service, and surrender. Thus, Melchizedek and Jesus show us that the eternal priesthood is accessible to all who desire to live in communion with the divine and become instruments of peace and justice. Furthermore, the eternal priesthood is an invitation to self-knowledge and the transcendence of human divisions. The absence of genealogy and records about the birth and death of Melchizedek symbolizes that the spiritual path does not depend on an earthly beginning or end, but on an eternal connection with something greater. This teaches us that, regardless of our origin or life circumstances, we are all capable of accessing this spiritual lineage. All it takes is an attitude of surrender and purpose. Another important aspect is the role of altruistic service. The eternal priest does not act to be exalted, but to serve. This idea invites us to reflect on the value of service in the spiritual journey. When we stop acting for reward or recognition and start acting out of love and compassion, we align ourselves with the order of Melchizedek. This priesthood reminds us that true greatness is not in titles or positions, but in the ability to touch lives with authenticity and humility. Spiritual transformation, therefore, does not occur through external imposition, but by the internal willingness to live a meaningful life. When comparing Melchizedek and Jesus, we notice that both not only received a calling, but fully embodied their purpose. The call to eternal priesthood is a call for consistency, to be what we preach, to live what we believe in, and to act in accordance with our divine essence. Furthermore, the symbolism of the priesthood suggests the idea that every human being carries within them a sacred potential. By embracing this potential, we can become agents of healing and reconciliation in a fragmented world. Just as Melchizedek blessed Abraham, we are called to bless others with our attitudes, words, and actions. Each act of kindness, each just choice, and each gesture of peace brings us closer to this eternal spiritual lineage. The eternal priesthood also teaches us the importance of balance between being and acting. Melchizedek, as king and priest, represents the perfect fusion between leadership and spirituality, between authority and humility. This reminds us that to be true leaders in our communities, families, and personal journeys, we need to cultivate both strength and compassion, justice and mercy. The path of the priesthood is not about superiority, but about responsibility and service. Finally, this symbolism points us to a profound truth, that the spiritual journey is continuous and eternal. Just as Melchizedek is described as without beginning of days or end of life, we are invited to live with an awareness of eternity, knowing that each present moment is part of a larger divine plan. The eternal priesthood is not a destination, but a path of constant growth, where each choice brings us closer to or further from the divine purpose. Therefore, the priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek is not just a position of honor, but a universal call to service, transformation, and communion with the sacred. It's a reminder that true justice and peace begin within each of us and manifest in the world through our actions. In the next chapter, we will explore how this lineage of justice and peace continues to inspire spiritual seekers to this day, and how we can apply it in our everyday lives to become participants in this eternal mission. The lineage of Melchizedek and its full manifestation in Jesus Christ is not just a historical or religious narrative, but a timeless invitation for us to reflect on our spiritual journey and the role we play in building a better world. In a world marked by conflicts, inequalities, and divisions, the message of an eternal priesthood, grounded in justice and peace, brings powerful and extremely relevant lessons for today. The first lesson we can draw from this lineage is the value of conscious service. Melchizedek does not appear to impose laws or claim power, but to bless and offer fellowship. Similarly, Jesus did not lead with force or imposition, but with compassion and surrender. In a time when ego often dominates relationships and decisions, we are reminded that true leadership is serving with humility and putting the good of others above personal interests. This kind of service connects us to something larger than ourselves and helps us live with purpose. Another essential teaching is the idea that justice is the foundation of true peace. Justice, according to the order of Melchizedek, is neither punitive nor partial, but based on truth, integrity, and fairness. This invites us to reflect on our daily actions. Are we fair in our judgments and decisions? Are we contributing to a peaceful environment or fueling divisions and conflicts? True peace is not achieved by the absence of challenges, but by the presence of justice and mutual respect. Furthermore, the eternal priesthood reminds us that spirituality is a state of being, not a set of external rules. Just as Melchizedek did not need a formal lineage to be a priest, we too do not need titles or credentials to connect with the sacred. Our commitment to justice, peace, and service is what makes us participants in this spiritual lineage. The pursuit of authenticity and coherence between what we believe and what we do is one of the greatest challenges, but also one of the greatest sources of transformation. Another point of reflection is the importance of communion and sharing. The gesture of Melchizedek offering bread and wine symbolizes an act of sharing and reconciliation. In an increasingly individualistic world, the simple act of sharing, whether it's knowledge, a word of comfort, or a moment of presence, can be a revolutionary act. The symbolism of bread and wine reminds us that we are not separated, but united in an invisible web of interdependence. We can also learn about the power of altruistic sacrifice. Both Melchizedek and Jesus show us that sacrifice is not the loss of something valuable, but the voluntary surrender for a greater purpose. In our daily life, this could mean giving up small vanities, resentments, or selfish desires to create spaces for reconciliation and harmony. By doing this, we draw closer to the ideal of a priesthood that seeks to heal rather than divide, to welcome rather than push away. The lineage of Melchizedek also teaches us to recognize the sacredness of the present time. The fact that Melchizedek is described as someone without beginning or end reminds us that our life is part of an eternal purpose, but it manifests in the now. Often we are stuck in the past or anxious about the future, forgetting that it is in the present where we make our most important choices. Living in harmony with this lineage means acting with full consciousness, knowing that every moment is an opportunity to honor the sacred. Furthermore, this story challenges us to question our definition of leadership and power. Melchizedek and Jesus demonstrate that true power doesn't lie in domination, but in the ability to guide with love, justice, and service. In the modern world, where leaders often seek control rather than inspiration, we are invited to reflect. Are we seeking power or purpose? Are we leading with the heart, or simply following external expectations? Another practical teaching is the need for reconciliation. Just as Melchizedek appeared to bless Abraham after a battle, we are called to be agents of reconciliation in a world filled with emotional and spiritual wounds. Melchizedek's blessing not only acknowledged Abraham's victory, but also reaffirmed that true victory is communion with God and others. When we seek reconciliation, even in difficult situations, we demonstrate that we are participants in this spiritual order of peace and justice. The lineage of Melchizedek also reminds us that our origin does not define our spiritual destiny. Just as he did not need a formal genealogy to be a priest, we too are not limited by our origins or pasts. Regardless of where we come from or the circumstances that surround us, we can choose to live in an elevated and righteous manner. This teaching is a source of hope for those who believe that their mistakes or limitations distance them from a meaningful spiritual life. Finally, this lineage shows us that transformation begins within ourselves. The order of Melchizedek invites us to abandon the old paradigms of power, punishment, and external sacrifices to embrace a path of inner renewal and altruistic service. By following this path, we can become spiritual leaders in our own spheres, blessing with our words and actions, and participating in the great mission of bringing justice and peace to the world. As we reflect on these teachings, we realize that the lineage of Melchizedek is not just a distant or symbolic idea, but an accessible reality. We are invited to become priests in our daily lives, agents of transformation, compassionate and fair in our families, jobs, and communities. This is the essence of the eternal priesthood, to live not to accumulate power or glory, but to serve the divine purpose with love, courage, and authenticity. In the next and final chapter, we will be crafting an inspiring conclusion, connecting all the dots and reinforcing the call to reflect and live consciously, participating in this spiritual journey of justice and peace. We have come to the end of this journey, where we explored the connection between Jesus and Melchizedek and unraveled the profound meanings of an eternal priesthood, grounded in justice and peace. But more important than understanding this story in theological or historical terms is to understand how it can inspire our own life. The priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek is not just an exclusive title. It is a universal invitation to live with purpose, faith, and compassion. Throughout the centuries, scholars and spiritual seekers have marveled at the figure of Melchizedek and what he represents. A call to transcend human limitations and embrace a mission of reconciliation and transformation. Jesus, being identified as the fulfillment of this lineage, shows us that spiritual elevation is not reserved for a chosen few, but accessible to all those who wish to live a life guided by truth, love, and service. Think for a moment. How many times have we allowed ourselves to believe that we are not worthy of something greater? How many times have we believed that we are defined by our past, by our failures, or by the circumstances that surround us? The story of Melchizedek and Jesus reminds us that our origin is not a limit, and that our true spiritual identity transcends any earthly obstacle. The eternal priesthood invites us to recognize our connection with the divine and to live with integrity, knowing that we are part of something much larger than we imagine. More than an archetype or a legend, Melchizedek points us to the idea that true spiritual leadership is silent, humble, and effective. It does not seek applause or titles, but acts with authenticity and wisdom. This is the essence of a true king-priest. Not to dominate, but to serve, not to divide, but to unite. Jesus embodied this mission by living a life of surrender and love, showing that true power does not reside in strength, but in the ability to fully give oneself to the greater good. The most important reflection we can take from this journey is, how can we live this calling in our daily lives? How can we be agents of justice and peace in a world that often walks in the opposite direction? Perhaps we don't need grand deeds to fulfill this mission. Often, it's in simple gestures, a word of support, an act of generosity, a moment of empathy, that we demonstrate our role as participants in this eternal lineage. Furthermore, the symbolism of bread and wine reminds us that true communion with the divine manifests when we share, when we break down the barriers of individualism and connect with others. This shows us that spirituality is not a solitary path, but a journey of communion and sharing. Just as Melchizedek blessed Abraham with bread and wine, we are called to bless others with the best we have, our time, our care, and our presence. Another crucial point is the need to embrace justice in our daily life. Justice is not just a matter of big causes. It reveals itself in our everyday choices, in the conversations we have, in the decisions we make, and in the way we treat others. Living in justice is to be consistent, integral, and always strive to act righteously, even when no one is watching. It's remembering that every small attitude matters and is part of a bigger plan. The eternal priesthood also reminds us that true peace begins within us. We cannot be agents of peace in the world if we live in constant internal conflict. This challenges us to seek self-knowledge, practice forgiveness, and cultivate a serene heart, even amidst the storms. Jesus showed us that peace is not the absence of difficulties, but an attitude of trust and surrender, even in the face of the greatest adversities. Finally, this journey invites us to reflect on our spiritual legacy. What will we leave for those who come after us? How can our actions today impact the future? The story of Melchizedek and Jesus reminds us that we don't need a title or a big stage to make a difference. By living with justice, peace, and love, we become part of an eternal lineage of purpose and service. The priesthood, according to the order of Melchizedek, did not end with Jesus. It continues to live in each person who chooses to live with compassion, truth, and courage. It is a calling that echoes through time, inviting us to awaken to our true mission, to be agents of healing, reconciliation, and spiritual elevation. So, the question that remains is, how can you answer this call? What steps can you take today to be an instrument of peace and justice in the world? No matter how small your contribution may seem, every gesture counts. Because just as Melchizedek appeared at a crucial moment in Abraham's journey, you can be the presence of blessing and renewal in someone's life. The final message is clear. We are all called to live with purpose, integrity, and service. By doing so, we become part of a larger story, the story of an eternal lineage of justice and peace, which transcends ages and continues to live in every heart willing to listen and act. And so we move forward, with the certainty that we are all potential priests, guided not by external rituals, but by the inner commitment to live with authenticity, faith, and love. After all, the lineage of Melchizedek reminds us that we are not merely observers of eternity, but participants in it. So mind unfettered, now that we've explored together the connection between Jesus and Melchizedek and reflected on the transformative power of this eternal lineage, tell me, what does this story awaken in you? Do you believe that we all can access this spiritual call for justice and peace? Share in the comments how you connect with your own spiritual journey and what practices have helped you to live with more purpose and balance. Your story may inspire others in this amazing community to also reflect and share their experiences. After all, when we manifest together, we create a powerful current of transformation. And before you go, if you want to keep unraveling spiritual mysteries and delve even deeper, click on the video that's appearing on your screen now. In it, we're going to reveal surprising secrets about Jesus' true mission that history has tried to hide. Don't miss out. Each piece of this spiritual puzzle is crucial to understanding your own journey. Unfettered mind, it's always an honor to share this journey with you. See you in the next video.